Hello again, everybody. Tom Tradup from All Israel News. And you're going to like this segment today, I can tell you. We have with us Ami Kozak. Ami, I like to refer to him as a Renaissance man. He may not like that title, but he's a music producer. He's co-founder and performer in the band Distant Cousins. You have a growing following in comedy clubs, doing stand-up comedy in New York and elsewhere. But lately, you've taken on a new role as sort of the intelligent voice of reason. I don't know if you want that title or not, in debates over the Israel-Hamas war, and that's why we want to talk to you today, as well as the rise of anti-Semitism in America. Ami, welcome.
Tom, thank you. Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I saw you I guess it wasn't really a debate. It was a podcast appearance with the political activist Candace Owen, who I like a lot, talking about Israel and the Hamas attacks and their retaliation, et cetera, et cetera. And you said one reason there isn't more support for Israel here in the United States is because of what you called ill-informed pacifists. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. And, like you said at the outset, I don't consider myself a scholar. I am obviously intellectually curious and read a lot about this stuff. But when I put myself out there publicly, historically, traditionally, it's been in the form of entertainment and it's been in the form of comedy, music. I prefer to make people dance and laugh and sing as opposed to really anything else. But more recently, now it's been sort of doing what's required to make people think and force them to confront the realities of this issue. There's sort of a bittersweetness to being known to have to advocate for such things because it's by the nature of the fact that it is necessary to have to advocate for such things is sort of a reminder that people for some reason are very confused morally about the issue, even when it seems very morally obvious which side to take, especially after the events of October 7th, when we saw the barbarism and savagery of Hamas, and you see the Western liberal country of Israel fighting to defend its citizens and protect human life. But on to your question of ill-informed pacifism, I do think that, and maybe perhaps it correlates to political or certain temperament on the far left, that when confronted with evil, when confronted with barbarism, savagery, when confronted with it, it's so hard to face it head on that it's easier for us to sort of externalize the atrocious actions of certain actors and say no one is responsible for anything. War is simply this external abstract thing that descends upon humanity. And when it does happen, we need peace. We need to avoid it. There's no aggressor. There's no defender. Pure moral equivalence, pure neutrality, pacifism. That feels palatable for people. That feels like something that people could get behind. What's wrong with pacifism? We just want peace. And they're forgetting a key factor in that equation, that when you live in a world where you have competing values, where you have people who don't value life and who don't value freedom and who don't value peace, and they are acting upon those principles by aggressing against you in a war of aggression where someone has attacked and violated your rights to begin with, well, then you have to respond with force, and then you have to respond with self-defense in order to achieve peace. It's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. So you have to be able to defend yourself, and in order to get peace, you need to eliminate those entities and those regimes that do not want peace, that do not want coexistence, that do not want tolerance, and that do not want freedom.
And as you've said, to call for a ceasefire in the face of aggression is not moral. It's just absurd.
Correct. I mean, it's suicidal. Your only options in those circumstances is basically to roll over and die and take it. And that's not moral. Pacifism is not moral as a principle. Being anti-war in all circumstances is not moral in the face of aggression, because the choice, as I've said on many podcasts and publicly, is your choice is self-defense or suicide in these scenarios. Let them kill you or fight back and defend yourself. And it is obviously moral, and everybody's moral instincts, if you examine it just beneath the surface, is to defend yourself.
You have family in Israel. You have friends in Israel. You've visited many times, lived there for a year yourself. So you're an American Jew who's very closely aligned with the state of Israel. You're a strong supporter. And yet you also are on record as sympathizing with, for example, Palestinian parents whose children are killed in the war. And that has opened you up to criticism from some people saying you're looking for some kind of moral equivalence in this situation. And it's kind of just the opposite of what you're doing, isn't it?
Yeah, listen, I mean, I think people have to remember that if, I am torn about this, but at the same time, the optics of war are horrible, and children, I mean, really children, babies, children are not guilty necessarily, obviously not guilty for the sins of their parents or the sins of adults in the room who've acted upon their behalf. And it's important to remember that accountability is the factor here, not the tragedy of innocent people who die. We don't want to, we're not going to stoop to the level of denying the tragedy of civilians and collateral damage caught in the crossfire of war. But it's important to always make the distinction of who is accountable. It's not always the ones who pulled the trigger in self-defense that are accountable for the tragedy of human life that is lost. It is the fault of the aggressor, the nation that, the entities that attacked Israel to begin with, that brought this on. They knew it would bring this on, and this is the tactic and the strategy of Hamas to maximize civilian casualty on both sides. And at the same time, I do think it's important, and I haven't really gotten too much criticism for saying that and being able to make those distinctions. But I don't think it's healthy, or I don't think it's productive to fall into the trap of, oh, it's this cycle of violence. It is simply this thing that is just happening in the abstract. And there is this campaign and this idea about free Gaza from Hamas. If we just get rid of Hamas, if we just eliminate that entity, then we're left with a peace-loving population that's ready to embrace Israel. And the truth is, if you look at the city streets and the mobs of people cheering for a woman with broken legs who's dead and dragged through the streets on a truck, and they're all cheering, or the hostages being brought back and everyone's cheering and harassing them, I don't feel as optimistic going forward that, when we see statistics coming out about 75% of a population supporting the actions of October 7th, I wish it was so, that this is simply one small oppressive regime oppressing everybody who are otherwise peace-loving. I do think that's true in other cases. I mean, you see in countries like Iran, you see large moderate populations speaking out against the government and fighting in the streets of the regime separate from the population. I would hope it's the case that one day you can have a prosperous a Palestinian state that embraces coexistence with the Jewish state of Israel, and there can be peace and trade and commerce between the two countries. But that seems more of an illusion at this point, and more of a wishful thinking prospect, just looking at what I'm looking at. And I hope it's not so. I wish it wasn't so, but I think it's important to be real in assessing where the hostilities are and how much of the population supports what Hamas has done.
Well, and also the fact that, it's true that not all residents of Gaza, for example, are members of Hamas. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that they voted to have Hamas be the leadership of Gaza. So, it is sort of a circular logic argument. But I wonder. Yeah,
but we can't say it. We can't say on the one hand how evil Hamas is for putting their civilians in harm's way and using human shields, while dehumanizing the human shields that we're talking about. I mean, we are using you don't want to talk on both sides of your mouth. So just to kind of say the other thing as well, it's like, well, we know how evil and morally depraved it is that they're using people as human shields. So let's remember that we don't want to deny the humanity in the tragedy of war, but remember that it's accountable to Hamas and their acts of aggression and terrorism that bring this on.
The reason I love engaging with someone with your obvious intellect and compassion on this issue is that you've stated, and I think it's pretty obvious to people watching today, that you're not interested in scoring political points. Your goal is to bring out the truth. You stand for truth, and that's what All Israel News is all about. We bring the truth, whether people like it or not. It's unvarnished. Is it difficult for you to maintain that position, looking at, as we just discussed, the humanity of losing a child if you're a Palestinian and all that, in a time when people are so polarized by the atrocities committed by Hamas, when we're seeing people, we don't need to rehash all the horrifying things that have come out, but we think that's why so many female hostages still have not been released because Hamas doesn't want people to hear their stories of how they've been treated. Is it difficult for you to toe that line, trying to be rational, but still, as an American Jew, feeling obviously such kinship to the state of Israel?
Yeah. I think being rational doesn't necessarily mean being unfeeling. The two are not mutually exclusive to look at these things and assess the moral truth of a situation. And, not to say that Israel doesn't make mistakes or isn't culpable in some ways of certain and deserving of certain criticisms, but we're talking about severe matters of degree here and intentionality when it comes to using military force and the collateral damage and terrible consequences of war that are inevitable. You cannot, nirvana is not for this world. We do not have a situation where you could just push a button and only specific people that were responsible for October 7th, and only those people can isolate them. We don't possess that capacity and capability in human affairs and in war. In war, these kinds of things do happen, and it is a tragedy. But at the same time, standing up for the truth and standing up for humanity over cruelty. I mean, these are by the matters of degree, there's such a moral difference between Israel and its enemies. That's very obvious to me, so I try to do my best to point that out in assessing the situation. And in terms of your question, you're saying that is it difficult because it's so emotional and it's so difficult? Is it difficult to stay level-headed about it? Is that what you mean?
Yes, pretty much.
I don't.
You're human. I mean, you have feelings, and it's difficult to sort of be an observer when you also have, your heart with the people of Israel.
Oh, yeah. So on that, I do think it's important to make a distinction, and for people in the Jewish community or people who have a personal connection to Israel, it's a very important thing to make a distinction between one's subjective, call it a bias, call it a connection, call it a leaning, versus the ethical defense of Israel. And those two things are different, and it's perfectly appropriate, on the one hand, to be understanding to oneself that they're going to have a specific preference for those who they feel connected to, in terms of family, in terms of kinship, cultural history, religion, commonalities that you share. It's perfectly appropriate to feel a certain resonant pain than you otherwise would for other atrocities around the world that are just as objectively horrible, but you might not feel as personally connected. That's like saying, oh, I lost a family member, and someone coming to you and saying, okay, well, there's lots of people around the world who've gotten killed. Why should you care about your family member more than that? And we all know that that's ridiculous. What a ridiculous concept. As human beings, we have particular subjective connections to family and friends in our lives, in our circles, that we have subjective connections to more, that take precedent for us. And that's perfectly appropriate. So for people to say like, well, why are you speaking out about this issue as more than other issues? It's like, look, objectively, the violation of human rights and cruelty across the world should be condemned on an objective level. And then there's people who have subjective things, like if you lose a family member or a place that you're, it's like if there's God forbid a shooting in a church in Arkansas, that's a tragedy. If it's your church and you happen to know everybody there, and there's a mass shooting that takes place, it's also completely it needs condemnation and it is wrong on every level, and it hurts you subjectively a little bit more, and that's okay. Put that aside in one box. There's also the ethical defense, like saying if my family gets attacked, the whole society can agree that that attack is wrong. They don't have to all share my subjective pain and condemnation for it, but they can all condemn the actions that are immoral. And we have to live in a society that defends human rights and can condemn murder. That's why we have laws. That's why we have a society, so that we can all live equally under a law that is objectively enforced, even if each of us have different levels of preference in terms of how acts of violence occur in our own communities and our own families. The law and the Western values at large can respect and understand the differences and moral differences between societies that protect individual rights and societies that willfully violate them.
Well, speaking of Western values, that leads me to what's going on America's college campuses. It's clearly, we're living in this bizarro world where Jewish students are hiding in cafeterias and being told by one college president or senior administration person, they should hide in the attic. And you go, hello, anybody have any historical reference for Jews hiding in the attic? The presidents of Harvard and MIT and the University of Pennsylvania were testifying before Congress this week. And I have to say, just, you don't like to judge people's hearts or where they stand, but listening to them with their sort of lawyerly word processed comments about protecting students' freedom of speech and policies to be sure no one is discriminated against, and making an equal argument on behalf of protecting Jewish students but fighting Islamophobia. I never saw three more obsequious towers of Jello than those three college presidents. What do you think is the reason that so many people in this country have gone off the rails as far as what's happening on college campuses? And then a second part of the question is, what's your advice to moms and dads who are watching and listening as to what they should do if they're planning to send their son or daughter to campus, or they've got one on campus now? What should a parent deal with this?
So yes, on the administrative level, you're seeing spineless, gutless moral confusion. There's this quote, I forget who it is, maybe Thomas Sowell. There's something so ridiculous, only an intellectual would believe them. And I think, for me personally, this is like the nail in the coffin of the Ivy League institutions as places that teach you not how to think, but what to think. The full indoctrination of these students into the worst ideas of the left. Call it that loosely, but the worst ideas in terms of moral relativism, moral subjectivity, not being able to, not only like being morally confused on a sophisticated ethical level of understanding morality, but basic human decency out the window that is manifest in seeing what these students are doing, ripping down posters, thinking they're doing something virtuous.
Yes.
Distortions of basic human decency. And I think that when it comes to, this has been the nail in the coffin for me. And I think a lot of people are, at least through this lens, are seeing it and seeing that I think in 20 years from now, I mean, the obsolescence of the Ivy League, it's just proving more and more to be more and more obsolete. The credentialism that you may have needed to need once upon a time, that was once required for a good paying job and a good life, is slowly being eroded and being revealed here in these hearings. Look, take the word Jew out of it and replace it with black or other minorities, but like replace it with black. Do you have a policy that when it calls for the genocide of African-American students on campus, is there a policy against that, or whatever the question was? But take the word Jew out of it and put black. Would they dance around that? Well, we need to also protect against the backlash against white students, against racism against whites who might be saying those things. We don't want to create a certain environment, like the way they say, well, we have to also protect against Islamophobia. I'm like, it's so, for some reason, in other forms of racism, sexism, homophobia, very easy to unequivocally condemn for these people because it fits a certain narrative. Put the word Jew in, well, we have to contextualize. It depends on what follows. It depends on this and that. We have to look at our policies and understand the specific context of the anti-Semitism. Do the remarks lead to harm? Now, look, I'm all for free speech. I'm all for the marketplace of ideas, but it's just really, it's really astounding. The marketplace of ideas also requires that people take moral stances. We're not telling them to arrest students necessarily, unless they do cause violence or incite violence. But you can say with moral solidarity and clarity, right and wrong, and condemn speech. That's part of speech, is condemning bad ideas, not tolerating bad ideas and turning the other way and saying, well, I can't take any moral stance. That's the same kind of pacifism that we talked about at the beginning. And this is the pacifism of the mind, or just the brokenness of and the collapse of the moral clarity of these administrators. And on the administrative level, it's less forgivable. These are the adults in the room. Students, and on the one hand, they're subject to that confusion. They're trying to figure themselves out, and they come to these institutions. They're looking at the apparatus of the professorship and the intelligentsia, and then they're forced to question things. And in principle, to question things is good, to reevaluate. But now they're saying, wait, if these are the adults in the room, if these are the people that are telling me that I've been wrong and indoctrinated to believe America's better and that there's moral superiority in terms of values and cultures, like maybe I have to rethink everything. And their minds are being polluted. And if you're 19, 20 years old, It's slightly more forgivable and slightly more redeemable with time, but I blame the apparatus of these administrators who won't condemn Hamas. They will not take a stance against that. But in the Black Lives Matter movements, when it comes to civil rights, LGBTQ, I mean, they take full moral stances. A celebrity who made the wrong joke or the wrong comment should be completely fired and canceled. That's easy to say, but for some reason, calling for the genocide of Jews or violence against Israel, Intifada revolution, the celebration of violence, and the intimidation and harassment of Jewish students on campus, somehow that needs to be contextualized and thought about. I mean, it's insane. And I think it's being revealed very clearly, like what kind of spineless moral cowardice and moral depravity we're looking at on the institutions. Where does it come from? Just to finish on that point, I do think when you look at the world in terms of oppressed and oppressor, and group identity is paramount, and it's simply a tribal battle for power that you see in sort of the neo-Marxist, as Jordan Peterson talks about, postmodernist neo-Marxist view of the world. They look at racism not in principle as simply discriminating against people for immutable characteristics, but they co-opt the language, reframe what the language means to say, no. Whichever group we perceive as prosperous or doing well, they necessarily are doing well because of exploitation. None of those gains are legitimate. It's nothing that they're doing right that is to be credited to them. It is only the exploitation of the underclasses. And therefore, this is sort of that Marxist view, oppressor and oppressed, Israel being the prosperous nation, Jewish people being perceived as a successful minority. They are necessarily successful due to the exploitation of other marginalized groups in the society. And therefore, it is impossible to be racist against a Jew. It is impossible to be racist against a white person because we've completely morphed and distorted what the word racism means in order to fit this narrative that those in the oppressed class that we deem marginalized and oppressed are virtuous necessarily, no matter what they do. So they can commit acts on October 7th, and that's acts of terrorism and barbarism, and that's resistance. They can destroy property in the streets of the United States, and that is peaceful protest, and burn down buildings. That's peaceful protest, because these are in the group that's oppressed, that we deem oppressed, and therefore what they do is virtuous. And everyone else who tries to defend against it is necessarily the villain. That's where it comes from.
Just difficult to imagine paying $60,000 or $80,000 a year to have your child have that mush put in their head. But
yeah,
in the time we have left, I want to talk about Ami Kozak, the comedian. You know, you've been very courageous. You've stepped up on some podcasts, as I mentioned, in interviews like this, where you are. And again, I'm not being overly solicitous of you. You're an intelligent guy. You clearly are well-read and know everything. You're not just a guy up there reading some one-liners and getting guffaws in a stand-up comedy routine. But I wonder, you mentioned comedians who make a mistake or tell a bad joke or something, and suddenly they're in cancel culture. Mm-hmm. So many comedians over the years have taken a turn into non-comedy. I think of Ellen DeGeneres. She used to be, I think, one of the funniest people in comedy, had her own TV show. And on her TV show, she came out as being a lesbian. And we're like, okay, that's fine. That episode was great and it was funny. Now let's go back to being funny again. And the next episode, it was her boss on the TV show wouldn't let her babysit his daughter because she's a lesbian. And the next week, Ellen's neighbor didn't want to rent her an apartment because she was a lesbian. At that point, we go, let's go watch some car crashes over on ESPN. What does it mean to you as a guy who has comedy as a big part of your life? Are you able to transition back to stand-up routines from this, or will people now see you as the serious guy?
You know, I think you do what you do, and people perceive it how they perceive it. I don't worry too much about it. I did make a conscious choice to do some serious things as on my social media that usually people come for sort of an escape. But I found that in a world where people were so morally confused, you know, in a world that doesn't, you can have to do comedy in an environment where people respect each other. That's how you can make fun of each other. Comedy is sort of the expression and celebration of a world that is tolerant and forgiving, and we can say harsh truths in comedic ways so that we can laugh about it together and celebrate differences. And it doesn't come from a place that's ugly or hostile. But in a world where there's actual hostility and actual a complete like collapse of respect for someone's right to exist. I felt that the days of comedy are numbered if you don't speak out against that. So it wasn't just speaking out on behalf of my people per se, or taking on a specific cause for me. It felt like I needed to address some of these moral confusions. Otherwise, we'd end up in a very dangerous place. I could just see it going that way. So I feel like comedy has to exist in a place that's free and open and respectful. And having said that, you know, look, my goal when you get up on stage, I do really, for the most part, subscribe to the goal should be to make people laugh. Like the goal of comedy is to be funny. But at the same time, there's also satire, which is a subgenre of comedy, which is to be funny and really highlight a point, or funny off the heels of something you're trying to say, like the way South Park does it. And I started doing some of that on social media too, like highlighting things that I found absurd, but putting it in a funny to amplify what's true about that. And in a way, comedians have to tell the truth. Otherwise, it's not funny. There has to be a part of it that is relatable and resonant in something true. And in doing so, if you're getting analytical about what comedy is, you know, whether it's doing an impression and highlighting the eccentricities of somebody, you're highlighting the truth, the essence of somebody, and it's revealing and very funny. And by that same token, you know, like I'm a little less judgmental, maybe because I've done it myself, of comedians who kind of have a stance or something like that. What I don't like is pretending you're just trying to be funny, but disguising that disingenuously in a political talking point or a preaching. You know, you can make it, if you have a serious point to make the point. If you have a joke, tell the joke. And if you're doing satire, do satire. But don't try to confuse the two and overlap them by saying something serious. And when you get backlash for it, you say, I'm just making a joke. You know, there are comedians that have done that where they end up coming across as very preachy and judgmental, and then hiding behind the guise of, I'm just a comedian, can't take me seriously. And I've seen stand-up sets that, you know, or acts that have done that, where it dips into commentary and there's no punchline, so there's no intention of humor, and then it's confusing and a bit subversive and disingenuous, I think. So it's up to the individual comedian entertainer to decide how they want to approach that. Obviously, I think funny wins, and therefore, like, I'm never in favor of canceling or protesting. I celebrate every attempt at a joke, and some people are going to find it offensive. But if people laugh involuntarily, that means it's hitting something true, maybe uncomfortable, but true. And it's okay as long as we can tolerate, you know, even a joke, oh, that's kind of offensive, but I like that. I like that he went for it. It pushes the edges. I mean, in the spirit of comedy, that is a noble, sacrosanct pursuit, you know. So I subscribe to that. And then I don't like when it disingenuously blurs the lines. I was just joking around. You can't criticize me for those ideas. It's like, well, no, if you're making a serious point and making ideas, then subject to a different kind of criticism and scrutiny than a joke that I'm evaluating purely on its comedic effect.
Well, Ami, I know that whether you're in the United States or Israel or anywhere around the world, people like to do two things. They like to laugh, and they like to think. And they like to be challenged. One of the things about talk radio, which I do in another job, is that we like to exist to let people hear opinions that they may agree or disagree with, but there's something that's being said outside their normal circle of friends. And we think that makes everybody more enriching. So we appreciate your time, and you're a very interesting guy, and I hope we can come back to you sometime.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Tom.